Many people saw the election of Donald Trump as the first significant spasm of populism in the West. But Brexit, the United Kingdom's decision to quit Europe, actually predated that American election by 5 months. It's been a little over 2 years since Brits narrowly voted 52 to 48% to leave the European Union. Where are things at now? For more on that, we turn to Ashley Prime, who spent 5 years working in Toronto, most of it as the UK's Deputy Consul-General. He now runs the London office of the Canadian strategic communications firm Navigator, and we are delighted to welcome you to the studio.
Delighted to be here,
Nice
Steve.
to have you here. Let's just start by going back. How shocked were you when people voted thumbs down to staying in Europe?
I was totally shocked. I remember that day very well. I stayed up to listen to the vote counting coming in overnight on the radio, on the television. And the morning of the result, I think I was as shocked as anybody else. Nobody anticipated the result that actually transpired.
Including the Leave side?
Including everybody. I mean, around 10 o'clock at night, London time, the UKIP leader, Nigel Farage, conceded defeat. The markets started to sort of buoy up, but around 2:33 in the morning, when the numbers really started coming in, we knew we had voted to leave the European Union.
Did you vote?
I did indeed.
How'd you vote?
I voted to remain.
How do you feel about that vote 2 years later?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I'm still not quite sure, as indeed I think most of the rest of the country is, what does it actually mean to leave the European Union? We've gone through a period of over 2 years now where we're trying to have a strategy that we can take to Europe that works in the United Kingdom, and it's all about politics. So we're getting close now. We're less than 200 days from when we leave the European Union. It's March next year.
Next March is the deadline. Do you think there will be a deal in place before that March deadline?
Well, the hope was that we'd reach a deal actually in October with the European Union. That's being pushed back. I would be very surprised if we have something concrete by the end of this year. But I'm an optimist, and I think that there will be a deal, or at least I hope there will be a deal in time for March. What that will precisely look like, I'm not quite sure as yet.
It's interesting. You say you hope there will be a deal, but shouldn't you, who hoped to keep Britain in the European Union, be hoping that things completely get, what's the expression you Brits use, bollocked up or something like that, so that you can't leave and you will remain?
Well, I think that's a possibility. I wouldn't have said that 2 or 3 months ago, but I think we're probably at a tipping point where A, we're getting very close, B, we don't have anywhere close to what a deal might look like. Thirdly, we don't have a strategy for actually just falling off the end of the cliff, i.e. a no deal. The government hasn't, it's thought about what preparation work might be needed. We don't actually have the infrastructure in place yet to deal with individuals coming into the country or goods coming across the channel.
Going to come back to that in a few moments, but you keep hearing, at least I think you keep hearing the option put on the table of, can we do this again? Can we have a revote? How likely do you think that is?
Well, as I said, I think we're possibly at a tipping point, and as time gets closer and closer to March next year, that may become more realistic. There is a groundswell now. The polls, which of course you can't necessarily trust, the polls suggest that if there was a rerun now, it would be heavily to remain rather than leave, because people are beginning to understand actually how complicated this is for the United Kingdom and what the possible likely outcomes are if we do leave, particularly without a deal.
You talk about complicated, and I was telling you before we started, Paul Somerville's a friend of mine. He lives over in the UK, former chief economist for one of the big banks here in Toronto. And he said trying to do Brexit is like trying to do an operation to disconnect two adult Siamese twins. The links are just so complicated and so everywhere, it's almost not doable. Do you like that analogy?
Well, I think that is right. The thing is that the government is pushing ahead with this, and it realises that it's something that's incredibly complicated to do. But, we keep hearing the will of the people. This is what democracy is, that the United Kingdom voted to leave, and we've got to do this, no matter how painful it is and no matter how difficult. The problem is, how we actually leave the European Union and what this actually looks like long-term for the United Kingdom.
Do you think people have an understanding? Let me take a step back. There are from time to time elections where people vote one way because they're angry about something, but then if you had the vote a week later and people understood that that's what might happen, they'd vote differently a week later.
That's correct.
Is that what's happening here?
Well, I think it's actually different, though, because with an election, eventually you can kick people out, and within the cycles of politics, that generally happens. But, this is actually, the question was, do you want to remain in the EU or do you want to leave? And I think the government at the time, the David Cameron government, misjudged that badly, in my view. It was a clear vote to leave of 52%. And if you look at the age range of the people who voted leave, it tended to be older voters. People who lived in the big cities tended to vote to remain. Younger voters tended to vote remain. So it split the country.
In hindsight, should this referendum never have been called?
I think it was a misjudgment, and that's being kind.
Oh, that's being kind. Would you say it was the worst political gamble in the history of the UK?
Certainly post-war, and with a black and white question of in or out. You have to live with the consequences. But I don't think anybody really, on either side of the debate, more so perhaps on the Leave side, understood how complicated this was.
Well, let's go through some of the key issues here. For example, the border with Northern Ireland. What's the latest thinking on how that might get resolved?
Well, that's one of the major issues that needs to be resolved before we get a deal. And it's also one of the most complex because it has history attached to it. It took us the best part of 40 years to reach the Good Friday Agreement, which ostensibly took the border away. And, since the Good Friday Agreement, we've pretty much had peace in Northern Ireland. Both economies of the Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland are pretty much integrated, both depend on each other. But it is ostensibly a hard border between the United Kingdom and the EU should we leave. There's been various ideas put up, particularly on the Remain side, of having VAT, which is the equivalent of GST, registrations for small businesses and some other bureaucratic things that might come into play. But everybody's saying, look, these are unworkable, unnecessary. Neither the North nor Ireland wants a border, and frankly, nobody else does either. The trouble is that Ireland is going to remain in the EU, and what do you do with goods? But equally, what do you do with people?
Well, let me pick up on that. What happens to British citizens living in Europe, and conversely, what happens to Europeans living in the United Kingdom?
Well, that's another one of the big issues that needs to be put to bed. The Prime Minister has indicated that all EU nationals that have been living here for the last 5 years can remain in the United Kingdom. Brits living overseas in the EU have slightly been forgotten about, but that'll all be tied up together. The UK government has started a registration scheme to get all EU nationals to register by the end of this year, and there's a pilot scheme going on. My sense is that will be fine. I mean, there's 3.5 million EU nationals living in the UK, and they're working and they're contributing. There's a ton of people, and how would how could you kick them out?
What about Scotland? What happens to Scotland?
Well, Scotland's very interesting because Scotland, of course, voted to remain, and that was on the back of the Scottish referendum, which narrowly kept Scotland as part of the Union. The Scottish nationalists, of course, have not been supporters of the government, and they see this, I think, ultimately as potentially, particularly if Brexit goes badly wrong, as another opportunity to bite on that cherry of Scotland leaving the Union.
Theresa May, of course, called a snap election not all that long ago, in which she had hoped to pounce while her popularity was good. As it turned out, she lost seats, and she is now in a much more precarious state than she was.
Indeed.
What are her political prospects at the moment?
Well, I think at the moment she's one of the reasons that she survived in a minority government is, of course, she brought in the Democratic Ulster Party, who are a part of the government now.
10 seats, eh?
10 seats.
Pretty precarious.
Indeed it is. Now, they look as if they're going to continue to withdraw their support on certain issues, particularly on the Brexit side. They want to leave the European Union. There's open revolt in the Conservative Party. I've never seen such vitriolic language within the Conservative Party. They're tearing themselves apart. This should be an own goal, if you like, for the Labour Party, but they themselves are tied up in their own issues, particularly of anti-Semitism and how badly that's been handled. So, the cards have been thrown up, and how they'll land, I do not know. I would, not wish to predict, but you could come to a point in March next year where any deal does not get through the European Parliament, the UK Parliament, nor indeed through all the member states, and you could have a constitutional crisis in the UK.
Can I just confirm that? MPs in the British Parliament are going to have a chance to render their verdict on this?
They are.
That is for sure.
Yes, and that was, in fact, the original intention was that the Parliament would not have a vote. And a UK woman, Gina Miller, took the UK government to court. and the Supreme Court agreed that Parliament should have a say on whatever the deal was. Now, the numbers at the moment are looking pretty precarious. Theresa May has a number of MPs on her side who are very much on the Leave side and will vote against the government. So she may end up looking for support on from the Labour benches, which of course that would stick in their craw to support the Conservative government. So anything could happen. For a second referendum, that will need parliamentary approval. So if we come to a constitutional crisis that the deal is not approved through Parliament, I suppose there's a possibility that we could have a second referendum, but that would need parliamentary sign-off for that.
On the one hand, all of these permutations that you've described are quite horrifying, but on the other hand, as a sort of astute observer of politics as you are, it's all pretty unprecedented and exciting, isn't it?
Well, you could say that. It's certainly unprecedented, and indeed it is exciting looking from the outside, but in the UK it is not exciting. I mean, there's a number of things. We are divided as a country. We see ourselves as either Remainers or Leavers, and that is how we define ourselves politically now.
Can you imagine a Britain that is better off outside the European Union?
Well, nobody is saying that. Even on the Leave side, they are saying this will take a number of years to work through, and there will be sort of road bumps. One of the major Brexiteers, Jacob Rees-Mogg, said it'll take 50 years. Well, who knows where we'll be in 5 years? 50 years' time, we may not even be around.
So you're laying out a scenario here whereby even those who are in favor of Leave are saying it may take 5 decades for this thing to actually show some dividend.
Indeed. I mean, both, economically and socially, Britain is not going to be in a good place. I think the damage is already done. The damage is already done in the United Kingdom, and certainly our international standing, our reputation overseas is not in a great place.
Let me pick up on that. As you look at the bigger picture, how Britain fits into the world internationally, in whose interest, in your view, is it for Britain to leave the EU?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and I think that there's a wider question on that, in whose interest is that Britain is leaving, that Britain is divided, that Europe is weakened, that potentially NATO is undermined, or indeed across the Atlantic here in North America, that Trump is in power. It is not in our interest for that to happen.
In whose interest is it?
Well, I think that points in every case, it points to Russia, that it is in Russia's interest for their own strategy, for their own future, that Europe is weakened.
It is now known, well, let me put it this way. 17 American intelligence services say that Russia interfered in the American election, even though the president tries to deny it. Do we know what kind of efforts secretly were undertaken by Russia to involve itself in the Brexit vote?
Well, I think, similarly, there was certainly some Russian tampering, if you like, on the Brexit side. But, in the UK, people don't seem to care about that. It's kind of
they don't care that Russia interfered?
Well, there's a kind of shrugging our shoulders as well. We've got to leave the European Union. OK, Russia may be involved, but, we just got to get on with it. And I think what has changed, though, in our view of Russia is really since the Salisbury poisoning. And I think that was a glimmer, really, of some great diplomacy where the UK government got international condemnation and sanctions on the Russians for their behaviour. So Russia is in a sense, on watch now, if you like. But, there's no doubt, I think, in my mind, that it is in Russia's interest. Remember, they have Crimea. We forget that they have South Ossetia and bits of Georgia, and they've had that for a long time now. And my view is that Putin would be quite content to recreate what was the former Soviet Union in terms of territory.
I can't imagine, though, that there are people who voted to leave who did so thinking that they would be facilitating a Russian international new order.
No, I don't think anybody did.
Right.
I think because the way it was touted was simplistic. It was, we pull out of the European Union, we close our borders to EU nationals, they can come in the same way as anybody else, they can apply for visas to come and live in the United Kingdom. We can, control that immigration, and immigration is a big issue. There's no doubt about that. And we can give the £350 million a week that we give to the EU as part of our budget contribution. We'll have all that back and we'll give it to our healthcare system. The reality is, of course, we never actually pay 350 because we get so much money back from EU grants for agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. So the figure is far less. But that's what people saw, and it was simplistic. I think that was the way for the Leave vote to sort of tap in. But I don't think they expected to win. They were as surprised as anybody else that they won. But it's taken us down a road with consequences that none of us could have foreseen.
Well, let's finish up on that. By spending 2+ years utterly focused on Brexit, I mean, countries have a finite amount of bandwidth, right? You can't chase everything all
Correct.
the time. What has Britain lost by being so utterly focused on Brexit to the exclusion of potentially other things?
Well, I think that Brexit, because it's taken up so much political energy and horsepower, there is little left to run the country, if you like. If you think of where the UK was prior to the referendum, we were the fastest growing economy in the G7. We'd just come out of the Olympics. London was the coolest place on the planet. Britain was, flying high. Now, in terms of our economy, we're sort of bouncing around along with Italy and Greece, with a much slower growing economy. And I think that my big worry is that the markets again will speak in the way they did after the referendum. We have lost 20% of the value of sterling. And we haven't recouped that with UK exports in the way that was expected.
But the Leavers seem to be prepared to pay that price in order to have a Britain that they recognize better.
That's right. That's right.
You find that?
Well, to me, it's like sort of an Edwardian view of the world, really. I mean, the world has changed, it's moved on, and, Britain has its place in it, and I still think Britain is an amazing country. But we are now heading down a road with uncertain consequences.
We want to thank you for spending so much time with us here on TVO tonight, helping us figure out what's going on with Brexit. That's Ashley Prime, former Deputy Consul-General from the UK to Canada. Thanks, Ashley. Good to see you again.
You're welcome.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.